My name is Hannah Cole, and I thought my birthday would be simple this year. I turned 28, and I expected cake, noise, and maybe a few kind words. I worked long shifts as a nurse, and I was tired in a good way. When Brian Cole called, he sounded cheerful, almost proud. He said he planned something special, and he wanted family close. I should have heard the warning in his sweetness, but I wanted to believe. When I arrived, the house was full, and the living room felt staged. There were about 43 people, relatives I barely knew, neighbors and friends from Cedar Grove Community Church. Diane Cole moved through the crowd like a host on a mission, smiling wide, touching arms, guiding attention. My half-sister, Kayla Cole, sat near the center, glowing in a dress that looked more bridal than festive. I told myself it was normal, because Kayla always loved being noticed. Someone handed me a plate, someone hugged me, and music played softly in the background. Then Brian stood up, tapped a glass, and asked everyone to listen. I waited for a toast, and my stomach fluttered with hope. Brian looked at me, and his smile vanished like a switch. He said he was tired of my attitude, and tired of my selfishness. He said I acted like the world owed me something, and he said I ruined every gathering. The room went quiet, and I felt heat rush into my face. Then he said the sentence that split something inside me. He said he wished I had never been born. He said it clearly, with witnesses, and he let it land. Diane did not stop him. She nodded, like it was truth. Kayla looked away, then glanced back like she was waiting for my reaction. I stood there holding my plate, hearing my own heartbeat. In that moment, I understood the party was not for me. It was a trap. And the next demand was already waiting behind the cake. The room stayed quiet, and I could feel every eye on me. Brian Cole let the silence stretch, as if it proved his power. Diane Cole stepped closer, placed a hand on his arm, and put on a soft, concerned smile. She told everyone that families argue, and that love is complicated. Her tone made it sound like I was the problem, and they were only being honest. Then Kayla Cole rose from her seat, holding a glossy folder like it belonged at a wedding planner's desk. She walked toward me with careful steps, and her eyes looked bright with expectation. Diane guided her forward and said this was actually a happy day because Kayla was getting married soon. The guests murmured with interest, and some people smiled again. Diane said they wanted to celebrate two things at once, my birthday and Kayla's big future. Brian nodded and said he raised me to be responsible, and now it was time to prove it. Kayla opened the folder and showed me a breakdown of costs, venues, dresses, photography, and deposits. The number at the bottom made my stomach tighten. They wanted my savings, $52,000, to fund Kayla's wedding. Diane said it like a reasonable request, like I should be honored. She reminded me I had no children, no mortgage, and a steady job. She said Kayla deserved a perfect day, and the family deserved pride. Brian added that I owed them because they housed me for years. He said I should stop acting like a victim and start acting like a daughter. I looked around and saw relatives nodding because Diane had already primed them. Someone from Cedar Grove Community Church said family helps family, and another person called it a blessing. My throat felt dry, and my hands went cold. I realized the insult was only the opening punch. They wanted to break me, then take from me, while the crowd watched. Kayla leaned closer and whispered that if I loved her, I would do this. Diane whispered that saying no would embarrass them. Brian stared at me like a judge, waiting for surrender. I took a slow breath and set my plate down. I did not raise my voice, and I did not cry. I simply said no, and I felt the room shift because they expected obedience, not boundaries. After I said no, Brian Cole's expression hardened, and the warmth in the room evaporated. Diane Cole looked shocked for half a second. Then her eyes narrowed, and her smile returned in a sharper shape. She turned toward the guests and laughed lightly, like I had made a joke. She said, I was overwhelmed, and that I always got dramatic when attention was on me. Kayla Cole's face fell, then twisted into anger, and she said I was ruining her wedding. Brian raised his voice and said I was selfish, and he reminded everyone how much the family had done for me. He listed groceries, school supplies, and rides, as if love should come with receipts. Diane added that I had a good job, because the family sacrificed, and now it was my turn to give back. People started murmuring, and I heard words like ungrateful and cold. Someone from Cedar Grove Community Church said pride is a sin, and another person said I should honor my father. I looked at the crowd and realized they were not hearing me. They were hearing the story Diane had already built. Kayla stepped closer and hissed that I had money sitting in the bank, and she deserved it more than I did. She said she was the one giving the family grandchildren, and that made her more important. My stomach flipped, but my voice stayed steady. I told her my savings were not a family fund, and my birthday was not a fundraiser. Brian slammed his palm on a table and said if I walked out, I should never come back. Diane pretended to wipe tears, and she said I was breaking her heart. I picked up my purse, looked at the cake that was still untouched, and felt a strange calm. I had spent years trying to earn a place in that house, and in one sentence, my father proved there was no place to earn. I walked toward the door, and nobody tried to stop me. They wanted me to beg, to apologize, to fold. I stepped outside into cool night air, and the sound of the party faded behind the door. In my car, my hands shook, but my choice did not. I drove away without looking back, and I knew the next move had to be swift, because people who feel entitled do not accept no aid. They escalate. I did not sleep much that night, and I did not wait for morning either. I knew Brian Cole and Diane Cole would move fast, because they always did when money was involved. Before sunrise, I drove to my bank, and I sat in the parking lot until the doors opened. When I stepped inside, my hands were steady, and my voice was clear. I asked to transfer every dollar from my savings and move it to a new account at Pine Ridge Bank. The clerk asked if I was sure, and I said yes without hesitation. I also canceled any cards linked to shared access, and I removed every authorization that could be used against me. While the paperwork printed, my phone buzzed again and again. Brian called, Diane called, and Kayla Cole called too. I did not answer, because I knew the pattern. First they demand, then they shame, then they threaten, and finally they beg. I walked out with confirmation papers in my bag, and relief in my lungs. Next I went to my apartment and made a list of everything tied to that house. My mail address, my emergency contact, my work records, and any account where Brian or Diane might still have a foothold. I updated passwords, changed security questions, and removed old phone numbers from contact lists. Then I called a moving company, and I asked about a small studio lease. I did not need a big place. I needed a safe place. By afternoon, I had signed a lease, paid the deposit, and scheduled the move. My phone finally stopped ringing, and a message arrived instead. Diane wrote that she was disappointed and that she expected better from me. Brian wrote that I owed him, and that family money belongs to family. Kayla wrote that I ruined everything, and she said she would never forgive me. I stared at the screen, then set my phone down. None of them asked if I was okay, and none of them apologized for the words at my birthday. They only talked about what they wanted and what they thought they deserved. That was when I understood my no was not a boundary to them. It was an insult. So I kept building the wall, calmly and completely, before they could find another door. While my new studio lease processed, I returned to the one place my parents did not expect me to go, my own records. I opened old folders, scanned emails, and pulled out bank statements that I had saved for years. I wanted facts, not feelings, because Diane Cole always won when the argument became emotional. I sat at my kitchen table and began adding numbers. Rent payments I covered when Brian Cole said the house was short. Utility bills I paid when Diane said it was an emergency. Grocery runs, car repairs, insurance gaps, and medical copays for Kayla Cole. I kept going until the list became a story on paper. The total made my stomach tighten, even though I knew it would be high. Over the years, I had paid about $134,000 into that household, and I had done it quietly. I did it because I believed love meant helping, and because guilt was the language they taught me. Now I saw what it really was, training. They trained me to fill the gaps, then punished me when I stopped. I printed the breakdown in clear, simple lines, and I wrote one note at the top. This is what I have already contributed, and it is more than enough. Then I placed the pages into a large envelope, sealed it, and wrote Brian Cole and Diane Cole's address on the front. I did not add insults, and I did not add a speech. I let the math do the talking. Before dropping it in the mailbox, I took a photo for my own proof. That same afternoon, Kayla texted again, saying she heard I moved my money. She said she would tell everyone at Cedar Grove Community Church that I abandoned the family. I read the message twice, then blocked her number. If they wanted to smear me, they would do it no matter what I said. I refused to fight in their arena. I packed my essentials, labeled boxes, and prepared to leave. In the quiet of my apartment, I realized something simple. People who live off your giving get furious when you finally show them the receipts. And I was ready for their fury, because my life was no longer in their hands. The day I moved, I did it quietly and early, because I did not want a confrontation. The moving crew carried boxes down the stairs, and I signed the final papers for my studio. When the door closed behind the last box, I felt a rush of relief that surprised me. My phone buzzed with missed calls, but I did not answer. I knew Brian Cole and Diane Cole would not call to check on my safety. They would call to regain control. By late afternoon, a message arrived from Diane. She wrote that she came to my apartment and she could not find me. She asked where I went, then demanded I come home. She said the family needed to talk, and she said I was acting childish. I did not respond. I kept unpacking dishes, hanging a towel, and making my new space feel real. That evening, Kayla Cole called from a private number, and I answered by mistake. Her voice sounded sharp and panicked. She said Brian was furious, and Diane was crying because they could not access the money. I asked what she meant, and she slipped. She said the wedding deposit was due, and they assumed I would transfer it. She said they already promised people things, and now they looked foolish. I laughed once, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. They were not worried about the words spoken at my birthday. They were worried about losing face. Kayla accused me of being cruel, and she said she deserved a dream wedding. I told her dreams do not come from stealing another person's life. Then I ended the call and blocked the private number. The next day, a relative from Cedar Grove Community Church reached out, asking if I was okay. Her message sounded polite, but it carried a hint of judgment. She said Brian told everyone I stormed out because I could not handle the truth. She said Diane said I was unstable. I wrote back one sentence, and then I stopped. I said Brian wished I had never been born, and then asked for $52,000. I did not add emotion, and I did not argue. I let the facts sit. A few hours later, the relative sent a short reply. She said she did not know that. I stared at the screen and realized the story was already shifting, because truth has weight. And in my new studio, away from their noise, I finally had room to breathe. A week later, Diane Cole announced a family meeting, and she made it sound urgent. She told relatives that I was confused and that we needed to fix things before Kayla Cole's wedding. Brian Cole agreed, and he invited people from Cedar Grove Community Church who loved giving opinions. I did not plan to attend, but a cousin texted me a detail that changed everything. She said a lawyer would be there, and the meeting was about the house. That word, house, tightened my stomach. I called the cousin and asked who the lawyer was. She said her name was Victoria Hayes. I recognized the name from years ago, and my pulse quickened. Victoria Hayes was the attorney my grandmother trusted, the kind of person who spoke softly and carried serious authority. I decided to go, not to argue, but to listen. When I arrived, the living room was packed again, faces turned toward me like a jury. Diane started speaking immediately, saying I abandoned the family and stole joy from Kayla. Brian said I was selfish, and that he sacrificed everything for me. Kayla sat with her arms crossed, wearing the same bridal glow, but her eyes looked nervous now. Then Victoria Hayes stood up, and the room quieted. She said she was there on behalf of Dorothy Cole, my grandmother. She said Dorothy asked her to clarify ownership of the property, because there had been confusion and loud accusations. Diane's face tightened, and Brian's jaw clenched. Victoria opened a folder and began reading. She said years ago, Dorothy transferred legal ownership of the house to Hannah Cole. She said it was done properly, filed with Maple County Records Office, and notarized with witnesses. She said the deed was in my name, and it was not a promise, it was final. The room went still, as if someone turned off the air. Brian looked stunned, and Diane's mouth opened, then closed. Kayla blinked rapidly, like she could not process it. Victoria said Dorothy did this because she feared I was being used, and she wanted me protected. She added that I had been paying bills for a home that already belonged to me. My hands went cold, because suddenly the envelope of receipts meant something bigger. Diane finally spoke, voice sharp, saying Dorothy was old and confused. Victoria replied that Dorothy was clear, and the records were real. In that moment, the family meeting stopped being about my attitude. It became about their lies, and the house they assumed they controlled. For a moment, nobody spoke, and I could hear the refrigerator hum behind the tension. Brian Cole looked from Victoria Hayes to me, as if expecting someone to laugh and say it was a prank. Diane Cole recovered first, because she always recovered first. She said this was unfair, and she said Dorothy Cole had been manipulated. She pointed at me and claimed I tricked an old woman into signing away the family home. My stomach tightened, but my voice stayed calm. I told Diane I did not even know the deed existed until this moment. Victoria confirmed it, and said Dorothy made the decision years ago after watching patterns in the household. Brian's face turned red, and he said the house belonged to him because he was the head of the family. Victoria replied that the deed does not care who feels like the head. It cares who is recorded as owner. Kayla Cole began crying, not softly but loudly, like a child whose toy was taken. She said, "Where would they live? And what about her wedding?" Diane wrapped an arm around her and glared at me, as if I caused the problem by existing. A relative tried to speak about forgiveness, and another person said, "Families should share." Victoria asked one simple question: did anyone contribute to the home financially? Diane started listing chores and emotional labor, and Victoria stopped her. She asked about payments. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder with my receipts, because I came prepared. I said I paid rent, utilities, repairs, and insurance, and I had already documented about $134,000. The room shifted again, because numbers remove fantasy. Brian tried to interrupt, saying I owed him for raising me. "Victoria," said, "children are not debts, and parents do not get to invoice adulthood." Diane's face went pale, then angry, and she said I was punishing them. I answered that I was protecting myself, and it was long overdue. Victoria then stated the next step clearly. If I chose, I could require Brian and Diane to vacate the property, because it was legally mine. The words hung in the air like thunder. Kayla's crying turned into gasps, and Brian's posture collapsed for a second. Diane looked around, searching for support, but faces had changed. Some people looked embarrassed, others looked shocked, and a few looked quietly satisfied. They had watched me be used for years, and now the truth had a title deed attached. I realized something in that moment. My father did not wish I was never born. He wished I was easier to control, and control was slipping fast. After the meeting ended, people spilled into the yard in awkward clusters. Some avoided my eyes, and some whispered apologies without courage. Brian Cole and Diane Cole stayed inside, pacing like trapped animals. Kayla Cole sat on the couch with blotchy cheeks, staring at nothing. Victoria Hayes asked if I wanted to speak privately, and I said yes. In the kitchen, she explained my options in simple legal terms. She said, I could allow them to stay under a written agreement, or I could serve a notice to vacate. She reminded me that ownership comes with responsibility, and boundaries protect both sides. I thought about my birthday and the words Brian said in front of 43 people. I thought about the folder asking for $52,000 and the way they tried to break me first. Then I thought about the years of bills I paid and the way Diane smiled while taking. My decision settled in my chest like a calm weight. I told Victoria I wanted them out because I needed safety and separation. Victoria nodded, and she said we would do it properly. The next day she prepared a formal notice and she delivered it with documentation from Maple County Records Office. The notice stated the timeline, the requirements, and the consequences for ignoring it. When Brian read it, his anger turned into panic so quickly it almost looked like whiplash. He called me for the first time in days, and his voice sounded small and tight. He said, Hannah Cole, please, we can talk. He said Diane was sick from stress and Kayla was devastated. He said I was taking the house away from the family. I listened without interrupting. Then I answered with steady word. I said the house was never theirs to take, and I was not responsible for their plans. Brian's voice rose, and he tried to shame me. Then he tried to bargain. He offered to apologize. He offered to sign something. He offered to stop asking for money. I asked him why he said he wished I was never born. The line went quiet, and I could hear him breathing. Then he said he was angry, and he did not mean it. I told him anger reveals truth, and truth has consequences. Diane grabbed the phone and cried, saying I was cruel. She said a good daughter forgives, and a good Christian does not evict family. I said faith does not require self-destruction, and I ended the call. My hands shook afterward, but my mind stayed clear. They were not sorry for using me. They were sorry the title deed belonged to me. And now the next chapter would be about enforcement, not emotion. In the days after the notice, the house became a pressure cooker. I did not live there anymore, but I heard everything through relatives who could not resist gossip. Brian Cole blamed Diane Cole for pushing too hard at my birthday, and Diane blamed Brian for saying the quiet part out loud. Kayla Cole blamed both of them because her wedding plans were collapsing. She called me twice from unknown numbers, and I did not answer. When I finally listened to a voicemail, she was screaming that I ruined her life. She said I was jealous, and she said I wanted to punish her. I deleted the message because I refused to be pulled into her fantasy. Victoria Hayes advised me to keep communication in writing only, and to document every contact attempt. She said emotional manipulation is often used to delay legal consequences. A week passed, then another, and the house did not empty. Diane sent a message through an aunt, saying they needed more time. Brian sent a message through a cousin, saying he could pay me rent. Both messages asked for favors, and neither message included accountability. Victoria reminded them of the timeline, and she kept receipts of delivery and response. Meanwhile, Cedar Grove Community Church chatter turned into a split. Some people said I was heartless, and others said they finally understood why Dorothy Cole protected me. Elaine Foster, a longtime church member, sent me one short note. She said, "I am proud of you for choosing yourself." That sentence hit harder than it should have, because it was so rare. One afternoon, I received a call from Dorothy Cole herself. Her voice was thin, but her mind was sharp. She said she heard about the birthday, and she was sorry I endured it. She said she transferred the house because she saw how they treated me, and she did not want me trapped. I thanked her, and my throat tightened. Dorothy told me something I will never forget. She said family is not the people who take, it is the people who protect. After that call, my resolve hardened. Brian and Diane could fight each other all they wanted. Their conflict did not change the deed, and it did not change my boundary. When the deadline arrived, Victoria prepared the next step, and I knew they would finally understand the difference between threatening and being enforced. On the morning the deadline passed, Victoria Hayes called me and said we were moving forward. Her voice was calm, and that calm made it feel final. She told me to stay away from the property, because conflict helps people delay consequences. She said the notice period was over, and now the legal process would continue with documentation and enforcement. Brian Cole tried one last time to slow it down. He called and said he had nowhere to go, and he said Kayla Cole was falling apart. He said Diane Cole was sick, and he said I would be blamed forever. I listened, then asked him one question. Where was your concern when you told me you wished I had never been born? Brian went silent, then tried to speak, and I ended the call. That afternoon, a deputy arrived at the house with the paperwork, and witnesses later told me Diane cried on the porch. She clutched a Bible and told the deputy she was being persecuted. Brian argued about ownership, and he insisted the family home could not be taken by a daughter. The deputy did not debate feelings, he followed procedure. He gave them clear instructions, and he documented their response. Kayla screamed at everyone, then stormed to her car and drove off. Neighbors watched through windows, because public drama always attracts quiet audiences. In less than 2 hours, boxes and bags were piled near the driveway. Brian and Diane loaded what they could, and left behind what they assumed would guilt me into stopping. But guilt does not move a deed, and it does not change a record. Victoria kept me updated by phone, and she confirmed the property was now secured. She advised me to change locks immediately, and to install cameras. I did both within the same day, because safety is not a suggestion. When I finally stepped onto the porch, the air felt different. The house looked the same, but the weight inside it was gone. I walked through each room, slowly, not with triumph, but with a strange, quiet grief. This was the place where I paid bills, swallowed insults, and tried to earn love. Now it was simply a property, legally mine, and emotionally complicated. I opened a window, let fresh air move through, and whispered a sentence to myself. I am allowed to live in peace, even if my family hates the price. 2 days after they left, Diane Cole tried a new tactic. She did not call me directly. She sent messages through relatives, layered with worry and prayer. An aunt wrote that Diane was sleeping in a motel, and that Brian Cole was depressed. A cousin said Kayla Cole was crying non-stop, and that the wedding might be canceled. Each message carried the same hidden request: let them come back. Victoria Hayes told me to treat every message as an attempt to weaken the boundary. She said compassion does not require access, and access is what abusers want. Still, the guilt tugged at me, because guilt was trained into me from childhood. I sat in my studio and reminded myself of the birthday night, the crowd, and Brian's words. I remembered Diane nodding, and Kayla waiting for me to fold. That memory was the anchor that kept me steady. Later that week, Diane showed up at the house while I was at work. A neighbor called and said a woman was on my porch, crying loudly and talking to herself. When I checked the camera, Diane was there, hands raised like she was pleading with the sky. She looked directly at the doorbell camera and said, "Hannah Cole, please, you are breaking my heart." She said she loved me, and she said she only wanted to keep the family together. Then she changed tone and said the church was judging her, and people were whispering. She said I was humiliating her. I watched the shift on screen and felt my stomach go cold. It was never about love. It was about image. I called Victoria, and she told me to document it and avoid contact. She said if Diane returned, we could pursue a no trespass notice. That evening, Brian texted from a new number, saying he wanted to meet and talk like adults. He promised he would apologize, and he promised he would never ask for money again. I wrote one short reply, and I kept it clean. I said, all communication must go through Victoria Hayes. Then I blocked the number. I did not feel cruel. I felt clear. They were trying to crawl back into the house and into my life, using pity as a key. I refused to hand them the lock again. After I blocked Brian's number, the messages shifted from pleading to punishment. Diane Cole began telling people that I threw them into the street and that I was greedy. She said Dorothy Cole manipulated me and that Victoria Hayes was forcing the family apart. Cedar Grove Community Church became their stage again, because it always had been. A friend from work told me she saw a post in a community group asking for prayers for a family betrayed by their own daughter. I did not respond, because I learned that defending yourself in public feeds the story. Victoria Hayes told me the strongest move was silence paired with documentation. Still, lies spread fast when people want entertainment. One afternoon, a church member I barely knew showed up at the hospital where I work. She approached my desk with a soft smile, then asked if I was proud of myself. She said my father was suffering, and she said I should forgive. I felt my cheeks heat, but I kept my voice calm. I told her Brian Cole wished I had never been born, and then asked me for $52,000. I told her the house deed was in my name years before, and it was handled legally. Her smile faltered, and she looked away. She said she did not know that, then walked off quickly. That moment reminded me how rumors survive. They skip the facts on purpose. Later that week, Kayla Cole left a voicemail from another private number. Her voice sounded shaky, but her words were sharp. She said I would regret ruining her wedding, and she said everyone knew I was jealous. She called me heartless. Then she asked if I could at least pay the photographer deposit. The whiplash was so obvious it almost made me laugh. I forwarded the voicemail to Victoria, and she advised me to add it to our file. She said repeated contact attempts could support a harassment complaint. Dorothy Cole called again, and she sounded tired of the drama. She told me she had spoken with the church elders, and she told them to stop enabling Brian and Diane. Dorothy said she did not give me the house to start a war. She gave it to me to end one. I sat in my car after work and stared at the steering wheel, breathing slowly. I realized my family wanted to keep the same cycle. Insult, demand, guilt, then repeat. My boundary broke the cycle, and they hated that. They could call me greedy, and they could call me cruel. But none of those words changed the truth. I was not their victim, and I was not their bank. I was the owner, and I was done. A month after the eviction, Victoria Hayes called me with an update that sounded almost like relief. She said, "Brian Cole and Diane Cole finally asked to meet, but not with me. They asked to meet with her because they were running out of options. Their motel money was gone, relatives were tired of hosting, and Kayla Cole's wedding plans were falling apart. Victoria said they wanted a deal, something that would let them return to the house, even temporarily. She also said they were still trying to argue that the deed should be reversed, as if paperwork could be negotiated like feelings. Victoria told them no, and she kept the meeting brief. Then she delivered information that made everything click. Brian admitted they had been relying on my payments for years because their own finances were unstable. He admitted they expected my savings, and they had already promised Kayla's wedding vendors money they did not have. Diane tried to shift blame, saying Brian made the decisions, but she also admitted she pressured relatives to shame me. Victoria documented every statement because admissions matter. After that meeting, Brian and Diane went back to Cedar Grove Community Church and tried to present a new story. They said they were seeking reconciliation, and they said I was refusing peace. But the elders were no longer naive. Dorothy Cole had spoken to them, and Victoria had clarified facts. When Brian asked for help again, an elder told him no. He said the church could offer counseling referrals, but not money, and not cover for wrongdoing. Brian's face reportedly hardened. Then he stormed out. Diane cried, then followed. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from a cousin, saying the family finally saw the receipts envelope. Diane had tried to hide it, but someone found it in a drawer. When relatives read the numbers, they stopped calling me selfish. They started asking why Brian and Diane took so much from me. The story began flipping, not because people suddenly cared, but because math forced them to. I sat in my studio, listening to the rain against the window, and I felt something settle. I did not need everyone to like me. I needed the cycle to end. Brian and Diane could keep performing, but their audience was shrinking. When the crowd stops clapping, the truth sounds louder. After the noise settled a little, I visited the house again, not as a guest, but as the owner. I walked through the rooms with a notebook, making practical lists. The roof needed a minor repair, the kitchen faucet leaked, and the furnace filter was overdue. These were normal problems, and normal felt healing. I scheduled a locksmith to recheck every lock, and I upgraded the camera system. I changed the mailbox key, updated my address with my employer, and forwarded my mail properly. Each step was small, but each step rewired something in me. For years I paid bills there while being treated like a burden. Now I paid bills there as a choice, and that difference mattered. Victoria Hayes advised me to keep records organized, because families who lose control often try to regain it through paperwork games. She helped me confirm the deed's status again, and she said everything was clean. Dorothy Cole called and asked how the house felt now. I told her it felt quiet, and she laughed softly. She said, "Quiet is what safety sounds like." Meanwhile, Kayla Cole was spiraling. A cousin told me she was blaming me publicly, then begging privately. She told people her wedding was ruined, then asked if anyone could cover deposits. When no one stepped in, she started lashing out, and she said I stole her future. I heard the words and felt nothing but distance. Kayla's future was not stolen by me. It was built on someone else's money without consent. Brian Cole tried again through a relative, asking if he could retrieve some furniture. Victoria said he could schedule a supervised pickup, and only for items he could prove were his. Brian hated that condition, because supervision meant no manipulation. Diane Cole sent another letter full of emotion and scripture, but it never apologized for the birthday. It only asked for access and offered guilt. I placed the letter in a folder and moved on. One evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun drop behind the trees. I thought about the night. Brian said he wished I was never born. Back then I believed his words defined me. Now I understood they described him, not me. They described a man who could not love without leverage. I was done living under that leverage. I did not need their approval to breathe, and I did not need their permission to own what was mine. The house stood quietly around me, and for the first time, it felt like a place I could actually rest. 2 weeks later, Victoria Hayes called and said, Brian Cole and Diane. Cole requested mediation. They said they wanted to resolve things peacefully, and they said they were tired. Victoria warned me that mediation is often a stage, but it can also create written agreements that protect you. I agreed to attend by video because I did not want to sit in the same room. When the call began, Brian looked worn down, and Diane looked angry beneath her polite face. Kayla Cole did not join, but her name hovered over everything like a shadow. The mediator asked why we were there, and Brian started with excuses. He said he was stressed. He said things he did not mean, and he said the family needed unity. Diane added that I misunderstood her intentions, and she said she only wanted to keep peace. Then the mediator asked about the money and the deed. Victoria presented documents, timelines, and my receipts. Envelope total, $134,000. The mediator asked Brian if he denied receiving those payments. Brian hesitated, then admitted he relied on them. Diane tried to claim they were gifts, but the mediator asked why gifts were demanded with humiliation. Diane went quiet. Then the mediator asked about the birthday request, the $52,000 for Kayla's wedding. Brian admitted it, and he tried to soften it by calling it a loan. I said, a loan is asked, not forced in front of 43 witnesses. The mediator then asked Brian about his statement, wishing I was never born. Brian looked down and said he was wrong to say it. He did not apologize with warmth. He apologized like a man checking a box. Diane said she regretted how things unfolded, but she still could not say sorry for the cruelty. Victoria kept the focus on outcomes. She proposed a written no-contact agreement and clear rules for property access. Brian wanted keys, and Victoria said no. Diane wanted to visit, and Victoria said no. The agreement offered only one thing, a supervised pickup of personal items on a scheduled date with no private conversation. Brian argued, then gave up. In the end, they signed because they needed the closure more than they wanted control. When the call ended, I felt tired, but lighter. They did not transform into good people, and they did not suddenly love me correctly, but they finally acknowledged, on record, that the house was mine, and the money they demanded was not owed. Sometimes healing is not a hug. Sometimes it is a signature that locks the door behind you. The scheduled pickup day arrived, and I prepared like it was a work shift. I ate breakfast, checked my cameras, and reviewed the agreement Victoria Hayes filed. The agreement was clear. Brian Cole and Diane Cole could collect specific items during a set window with supervision and no direct contact with me. Victoria arranged for a neutral supervisor, and a deputy was present to keep things calm. I stayed inside my car at the end of the driveway, far enough to avoid confrontation, close enough to witness. Brian arrived first, jaw tight, eyes scanning like he was looking for weaknesses. Diane arrived next, wearing sunglasses, even though the sky was gray. She stepped out with a dramatic sigh, like the world owed her sympathy. For a moment I felt my chest tighten, because old habits do not disappear overnight. Then I reminded myself of the deed, the receipts, and the birthday insult. The tightness loosened. The supervisor handed them a list of approved items and asked them to move quickly. Brian tried to wander toward the back rooms, and the deputy stopped him. Diane tried to ask about me, and the supervisor ignored the bait. Kayla Cole did not come, but she sent a message through a cousin saying she could not handle seeing the house. I did not respond. Brian and Diane loaded boxes, some furniture, and a few bags, and they kept glancing toward my car as if expecting me to brake. Diane wiped her eyes once, then looked directly at me, and her mouth tightened when I did not move. Brian whispered something to her, and they both looked frustrated. They wanted my reaction more than they wanted their belongings. When the last item was loaded, the supervisor asked them to sign a confirmation, and they did. The deputy confirmed the time, and the process ended cleanly. Brian drove away without waving, and Diane drove away without looking back. I sat there for a minute, after they left, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. The world did not collapse. The house did not shake. My life did not fall apart because they were angry. It felt almost anticlimactic, and that was the point. Real power is quiet, and boundaries are boring when they work. I sent Victoria a short message, confirming the pickup was completed. Then I drove to work. That evening, I came home, locked the door, and felt something I had not felt in years. Peace without fear. Peace I did not have to earn. In the weeks after the pickup, my life started to feel ordinary again, and ordinary felt like a gift. I went to work, cared for patients, and came home to a quiet house. I fixed small things around the property, replaced a broken latch, cleaned out a closet, and painted one room a lighter color. Each task was simple, and each task reminded me that I owned my peace now. Cedar Grove Community Church gossip faded, because gossip always needs new fuel. A few relatives tried to test me, asking if I missed Brian Cole, asking if Diane Cole was really that bad. I answered with short, calm sentences. Then I changed the subject. I stopped explaining, because people who wanted drama never wanted truth. Dorothy Cole called once a week, and she asked about my sleep and my meals. She did not ask me to forgive. She asked me to live. That difference mattered. Kayla Cole sent one final message through a cousin, saying she was devastated and that her wedding plans changed. I felt a brief sting of empathy. Then I remembered the folder, the demand, and the way she watched my humiliation like entertainment. I wished her growth, but I did not offer access. Victoria Hayes checked in to confirm the agreement was holding, and she reminded me to keep records stored safely. I created a folder with copies of the deed, the notices, and the signed terms. I also set reminders to review my accounts regularly, because protection is a habit, not a moment. Some evenings I still replayed my birthday, the crowd, the glass tap, and Brian's words, but the memory did not crush me anymore. It simply reminded me why leaving was necessary. I realized that the biggest change was not the house, or the money, or the legal papers. The biggest change was my voice inside my own head. It no longer asked, "What did I do wrong?" It asked, "What do I need to stay safe?" That question guided everything. I was not punishing them, and I was not trying to win. I was choosing myself, for the first time without apology. And when the world stayed quiet, I learned something else. Silence can be painful when it is forced, but silence becomes peaceful when it is chosen. When I look back now, I see how carefully the trap was built. It was not one cruel sentence at my birthday. It was years of small training. Brian Cole and Diane Cole praised me only when I gave them something: time, money, or silence. When I needed support, they called it drama. When I achieved something at work, they redirected attention to Kayla Cole. They taught me that love was something to earn, and that boundaries were selfish. I believed it until the night Brian told 43 people he wished I had never been born, and then demanded $52,000. That moment did not create the truth. It exposed it. I also see now how important records are. People like Diane survive on feelings and confusion. They want you to argue about tone, not about fact. The receipts, envelope, the deed, and the notice were the only language they respected. If you ever suspect financial manipulation, save your statements, screenshot messages, and write timelines. Do not wait until you are desperate. Another thing I wish I knew earlier is that community pressure is not morality. Cedar Grove Community Church members told me to forgive, but they did not offer to pay my bills. They told me to honor my father, but they did not sit in my place while I was humiliated. Advice is easy when it costs nothing. My grandmother, Dorothy Cole, showed me what real love looks like. It looks like protection, planning, and honesty. She did not demand my sacrifice. She demanded my safety. Victoria Hayes also showed me something important. You can be kind and still be firm. You can speak calmly and still enforce boundaries. You do not have to scream to be taken seriously. You need clarity and consistency. I do not tell my story to shame anyone. I tell it to remind people that family does not get unlimited access to your life. A title deed does not make you cold. It makes you secure. A no-contact agreement does not make you cruel. It makes you safe. When someone tries to take from you, then calls you selfish for refusing, remember this. They are not reacting to your cruelty. They are reacting to losing control. I lost a family fantasy, but I gained something stronger. I gained peace that I did not have to purchase with my own dignity. The next year, my birthday arrived again, and I noticed something strange. I was not afraid of it. There was no stage crowd, no forced smiles, and no hidden invoice waiting behind a cake. I took the day off, slept in, and made coffee slowly. Dorothy Cole called in the morning and sang a soft, crooked version of Happy Birthday, and I laughed until my eyes watered. Later, I met 2 friends for lunch, and we ate in a small place with bright windows. Nobody asked me for money, nobody tested my loyalty, and nobody tried to make me smaller. In the afternoon, I went to the house and walked through the rooms, listening to the quiet. I lit a candle, played music, and cleaned the kitchen while the sun moved across the floor. It felt simple, and it felt real. Brian Cole did not call, and Diane Cole did not send a letter. Kayla Cole did not try to contact me through a cousin. The silence was not punishment. It was distance doing its job. Victoria Hayes sent a short email that week, confirming there were no new issues, and the agreement remained intact. I filed the email and moved on. That evening, I baked a small cake for myself. Nothing fancy, just vanilla with frosting. I cut 1 slice, sat at the table, and thought about the birthday where Brian wished I was never born. I realized he did not get to decide that story. My existence was not a gift from him. It was a fact, and I deserved respect inside it. I also realized that walking away did not make me cold. It made me honest. I stopped buying love with my savings, and I stopped confusing guilt with duty. The house deed was not revenge. It was protection. The eviction was not cruelty. It was consequence. And the peace I live with now is not luck. It is a boundary that held. If you have ever been humiliated in the name of family, remember this. You can leave, you can document, and you can rebuild without asking permission. That is what I did. And for the first time, my birthday felt like mine. A few weeks after my quiet birthday, a letter arrived in my mailbox with handwriting I recognized. Brian Cole and Diane Cole had not contacted me directly for months, and I wondered what changed. I did not open it right away. I photographed the envelope, and I placed it on my counter. Then I called Victoria Hayes and asked what the safest step was. She told me to open it, keep it intact, and forward a copy to her for records. Inside was a long message that tried to sound humble, but it was built like every other attempt. Brian wrote that he had been thinking and that he wanted to be a father again. Diane wrote that she missed family dinners and that she prayed for reconciliation. They did not mention my birthday, and they did not mention the demand for $52,000. They did not mention the deed, and they did not mention the receipts. Instead, they focused on feelings and on how hard life had become for them. Brian said he was struggling, and Diane said the church was cold. They asked if they could come by for a conversation, just once, and they promised they would be respectful. I read it twice, and I felt the old tug of guilt trying to wake up. Then I remembered the porch camera, Diane crying for an audience, and Brian bargaining only when he lost. I also remembered Dorothy Cole's voice, telling me protection is love. I wrote a short response, and I kept it clean and calm. I said any communication must go through Victoria Hayes, and any request for access would be denied. I did not argue, and I did not explain. I chose clarity over comfort, because comfort was the trap. Later that day, Victoria confirmed she received the copy, and she said my response was appropriate. She reminded me that people who use you often confuse access with forgiveness. They want the door unlocked, not the relationship healed. That night, I locked my front door, checked my cameras, and sat down with a book. The house was quiet, my phone was quiet, and my mind stayed quiet too. It felt like proof that I made the right choice. Silence was no longer something forced on me. Silence was something I owned. After the letter, I thought things would quiet down again. Instead, the pressure shifted to a new direction. People who could not get access directly often send messengers. 2 different relatives called within the same week, and both opened with the same polite tone. They said Brian Cole was trying, and they said Diane Cole was hurting. They asked if I could just meet them for coffee, somewhere public, for one short conversation. They said it would help the family heal. I listened, then asked one simple question. Why did no one call to help me after my birthday? The line went quiet each time. One relative said she did not know what happened. Another said she thought it was private. I told them it was not private when 43 people heard it. I also told them the family did not ask for healing until money and housing were gone. That truth ended the conversation quickly. Later that day, Kayla Cole tried again, this time through a mutual friend from high school. The friend messaged me, saying Kayla was struggling, and she wanted to apologize. I asked what Kayla wanted to apologize for. The friend said Kayla did not explain, but she missed me. I took a slow breath and replied that any apology must be direct, specific, and in writing through Victoria Hayes. I knew Kayla would not do that, because accountability breaks her story. Sure enough, nothing came. A week passed, then a church elder reached out, asking if I would consider reconciliation counseling. He said he wanted peace in the community. I told him peace cannot be built on silence and pressure. I said, Brian and Diane could seek counseling for themselves, but I would not meet. The elder thanked me, and his voice sounded resigned. He had expected me to carry the burden again, and I refused. Dorothy Cole called that evening and told me she was proud. She said people always ask the strongest person to bend, because it is easier. She told me not to bend. I sat on my porch after the call, listening to the wind move through trees. I realized my boundary was changing more than my life. It was exposing everyone who preferred comfort over truth. That exposure felt lonely at times, but it also felt clean. I did not owe anyone a performance of forgiveness. I owed myself safety, consistency, and peace, and I was keeping all 3. One afternoon, after a long shift, I sat in my car outside the hospital and stared at my phone. A message waited from an unknown number, and I almost deleted it. Then I saw the name at the end, Kayla Cole. The text was short, and for the first time it did not sound like a demand. She said she was sorry, and she said she did not know the deed was in my name. She said Brian Cole and Diane Cole told her I was selfish, and she believed it because it was easier than questioning them. She admitted she enjoyed the attention at my birthday, and she hated herself for it now. I read the message twice, feeling a mix of anger and something softer. Kayla did not ask for money, and she did not ask for access. She only asked if I could forgive her eventually. I took a slow breath, because I knew forgiveness is not a switch. I also knew that growth deserves honesty, not instant comfort. I replied with one careful sentence. I said I heard her, and I appreciated the accountability, but trust would take time. I told her I would not meet, and I would not discuss the house, and any future contact must respect my boundaries. Kayla replied with 2 words, I understand. Then, the conversation stopped. I sat there in the fading light and realized something important. Brian and Diane were never just taking from me. They were shaping the story inside Kayla, too. They taught her that I existed to fund her, and that my resistance was cruelty. If Kayla was finally seeing the truth, then the control my parents loved was cracking in another place. That did not erase the past, and it did not make me responsible for Kayla's healing. But it did remind me that manipulation is generational, and it spreads unless someone stops it. Dorothy Cole called later, and I told her about the message. Dorothy stayed quiet for a moment, then said one calm sentence. She said a person can learn, but only if they stop blaming others for their choices. I hung up and felt steadier. My boundary was not a wall built from hate. It was a line built from truth. And truth, even when it arrives late, still matters. After Kayla Cole's message, I expected my heart to feel lighter. Instead, it felt clearer. Kayla was not the center of my story, and neither were Brian Cole or Diane Cole anymore. The center was me, and the life I was building without their permission. I stopped checking my phone for updates, and I stopped wondering whether an apology would ever come. I realized I had been waiting for years, not just for an apology, but for proof that my pain mattered. The proof had already arrived, and it was ugly. Brian humiliated me, Diane enabled it, and Kayla benefited from it. Their feelings after the fact did not rewrite the harm, so I shifted my focus to what I could control. I met with a financial planner, set a solid budget, and created an emergency fund that no one else could access. I updated my will, listed Dorothy Cole as a primary contact, and added Victoria Hayes as a legal reference if needed. Those steps felt adult in a quiet way, and quiet adulthood was my goal. At work, I applied for a training role, and my supervisor told me she trusted my steadiness. That word, steady, sounded like a compliment I had earned through fire. In the evenings, I started inviting a friend over for dinner once a week. Simple meals, laughter, and no tension. It taught my nervous system a new pattern. Home can be safe. Home can be quiet. Home does not need a performance. Cedar Grove Community Church noise faded even more because they lost the story they wanted. Without my reaction, there was no fuel. Dorothy reminded me that people sometimes prefer a villain because it simplifies their world. I refused that role. If Brian and Diane wanted to believe they were victims, they could. But they could not live in my house, and they could not live in my head. Victoria Hayes sent one final note, saying the file was stable, and no new violations occurred. I filed it, closed the folder, and placed it in a drawer. Then I did something small that felt huge. I bought fresh flowers for my kitchen table, not because anyone was coming, but because I deserved beauty in my own space. I realized that is what healing looks like. It is not a dramatic reunion, and it is not a perfect apology. It is a quiet life built on boundaries that hold. As weeks passed, the house stopped feeling like a battlefield and started feeling like a home. I made small changes that were not expensive, but they were mine. I replaced old curtains, cleaned out cabinets, and donated boxes of things that never belonged to me anyway. Each room felt lighter, and my chest felt lighter with it. One Saturday morning, Dorothy Cole visited, and she moved slowly through the hallway like she was checking a promise. She touched the doorframe, smiled, and said she was glad I did not give up. I made her tea, and we sat at the kitchen table while sunlight warmed the floor. Dorothy told me she saw Brian Cole's entitlement growing for years. She said he always acted like the world owed him loyalty, even when he gave cruelty in return. She said Diane Cole loved control more than honesty, and she used religion as decoration, not as guidance. Hearing Dorothy say it out loud made me feel less alone, because it confirmed what I lived through. Later that week, Victoria Hayes called to confirm the no-contact terms were still holding. She said there were no new violations, and the paperwork remained stable. I thanked her, then returned to my ordinary tasks: laundry, groceries, and rest. That ordinary life was the victory. Kayla Cole sent another short message, asking how Dorothy was doing. I replied politely and briefly, and I kept the boundary firm. I did not punish Kayla, but I also did not reopen the door. At work, a coworker asked why I looked calmer lately. I told her I finally stopped paying for chaos. That night, I walked through the living room, turned off the lights, and listened to the quiet. It was not the quiet of fear. It was the quiet of safety. I realized the birthday insult was supposed to shrink me, so I would pay without resistance. Instead, it woke me up, and it pushed me toward freedom. Brian and Diane could keep telling their story to anyone who listened, but their story no longer controlled my choices. The house was mine on paper, and now it was mine in spirit too. I slept deeply that night, not because everything was perfect, but because I was finally living in a place where my dignity did not have a price tag. One evening, I found an old photo tucked inside a drawer, a picture from my childhood. Brian Cole stood behind me with a stiff smile, and Diane Cole looked perfectly posed. I stared at it for a long time, then placed it back where it belonged, in the past. I realized the biggest shift was not the deed, or the eviction, or the signatures. The biggest shift was that I stopped believing I needed their approval to be real. That belief was the chain, and it broke the night they tried to use my birthday as a fundraiser. They thought humiliation would make me comply. Instead, it made me leave, and leaving was the beginning of my freedom. I did not win because I argued well. I won because I acted quietly and fast, transferred my savings to Pine Ridge Bank, canceled access, and moved before they could tighten their grip. I won because I documented, kept receipts, and let Victoria Hayes handle the legal weight. I won because Dorothy Cole loved me enough to protect me in advance. Those choices created a life that could not be bought, threatened, or shamed back into place. Cedar Grove Community Church became quieter in my mind because I stopped letting strangers define morality for me. People who judged me did not pay my bills, and they did not sit in my seat at my birthday. Their opinions were not a price I had to pay. Kayla Cole's apology did not change the past, but it reminded me that cycles can crack when someone refuses to play along. I hoped she would grow, but her growth was not my job. My job was my own life. I thought about the number $52,000 and how casually they demanded it. I thought about the total $134,000 I already paid and how quietly they accepted it. Those numbers were proof that love was never the goal. Control was the goal. Now the control was gone. I walked through my living room, turned on a lamp, and sat down with a blanket. The house was quiet, and my chest felt steady. That steadiness was the real ending. Not reconciliation, not revenge, but a calm life that belonged to me. I realized I did not need a final conversation to close the story. The story closed the day I chose myself and did not turn back. A few months later, another attempt arrived, quiet at first, then louder. Brian Cole filed a complaint with the county, claiming the deed transfer was unfair. He said Dorothy Cole was pressured, and he said I took advantage. Victoria Hayes called me the same day and sounded almost bored because the claim had no substance. She said the deed was filed properly, notarized properly, and recorded at Maple County Records Office years earlier. She said Brian was trying to create paperwork noise because noise is what he uses when control is gone. Victoria responded with documentation, and the complaint went nowhere quickly. When that route failed, Diane Cole tried the emotional route again. She showed up at Cedar Grove Community Church during a women's group meeting, and she cried about losing her home. She told people she raised me like her own, and she said I stabbed her in the back. A friend who attended texted me, saying some women looked uncomfortable, and some looked sympathetic. Then, the friend added one line that made me smile. She said, Dorothy stood up and told everyone to stop enabling lies. Dorothy, said Diane, did not raise me, she used me. Dorothy said the house was protected for a reason. After that, the room went quiet. Diane left early. That night, Dorothy called and told me she did not enjoy public conflict, but she refused to let Diane rewrite history. I thanked her, and my throat tightened again. It mattered to be defended, not by gossip, but by truth. Kayla Cole sent one more message, saying she heard what happened at church, and she was embarrassed. She said she was starting to understand how Brian and Diane built their stories. I replied briefly, and I wished her well, but I kept distance. My boundary did not move, because moving it would teach them the door was still flexible. The next morning I went to work, handled a difficult patient situation, and returned home, tired but calm. I watered a plant, checked my locks, and sat down with dinner. That is what stability looks like, small routines held by clear lines. Brian and Diane might try again, because entitlement rarely dies quickly. But each time they tried, the answer stayed the same. The house was mine, my life was mine, and I was not paying to be treated with cruelty ever again. Sometimes people ask why I tell this story at all. They assume it is revenge or drama, or a need to be right. The truth is simpler. I tell it because I wish someone told me sooner that humiliation is not love, and guilt is not duty. Brian Cole and Diane Cole used my birthday as a weapon because they thought I would fold. They counted on my kindness, and they counted on my fear of being judged. They invited 43 people to witness my pain, then asked for $52,000 like it was a normal gift. When I said no, they tried to erase me with shame. That was the moment I learned that boundaries do not require permission. They require action. I moved my money to Pine Ridge Bank, removed access, and built distance fast. Victoria Hayes turned my chaos into a legal process, and Dorothy Cole turned my loneliness into protection. The deed did not create a miracle. It simply proved what my family tried to deny. I was not a burden. I was an asset they wanted to own. When I enforced the notice to vacate, it was not cruelty. It was consequence. If you have ever been pressured to fund someone else's life, remember that generosity should be chosen, not demanded. If you have ever been humiliated in public to make you comply, remember that compliance is the goal of that humiliation. The most powerful response is not yelling. It is leaving. It is documenting. It is refusing to argue in a rigged room. Cedar Grove Community Church taught me another lesson, too. Communities often protect image until evidence forces honesty. Do not let reputation override your safety. Dorothy told me, family is the people who protect you. That is why I keep my boundaries firm, and why I keep my records organized. I do not tell this story to make Brian and Diane look evil. Their actions do that on their own. Intoned. I tell it so the next person recognizes the pattern earlier and chooses themselves without apology. My birthday was the day they tried to break me. It also became the day I finally woke up. One night after work, I pulled into my driveway and noticed a car parked across the street. The engine was off and the windows were dark. My stomach tightened for a second, because old fear rises fast. I sat still, watched my cameras on my phone, and took a slow breath. Then the porch light clicked on automatically, and the camera feed showed nothing on my property. I reminded myself of the facts. The deed was filed. The locks were changed, and Victoria Hayes had everything documented. I walked to the front door calmly, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The car drove away a minute later, and I did not chase it. If it was Brian Cole or Diane Cole, then they were testing the edge again. If it was a stranger, then the system still protected me. Either way, I was not a trapped daughter anymore. The next morning I told Victoria what happened, and she advised me to log it, then move on. She said control often turns into surveillance when direct access is gone. Dorothy Cole called later and asked if I felt safe. I told her yes, because safety was now a routine, not a wish. I checked my doors, reviewed my cameras, and kept my contacts limited. At Cedar Grove Community Church, the story had almost dried up. People who once lectured me about forgiveness had found new topics. That change proved something important. Public judgment is loud, but it is not loyal. When you stop feeding it, it moves on. Kayla Cole sent a short note, saying she hoped I was okay. I replied politely and briefly, then returned to my day. I realized I was finally living like a person who believed her own life mattered. I stopped expecting an apology, and I stopped expecting fairness from people who never offered it. I focused on my work, my health, and the quiet rhythms of home. The memory of my birthday still hurt, but it no longer controlled me. Brian's cruelty used to sound like a sentence over my head. Now it sounded like proof of what I escaped. The car across the street was a reminder, not a threat. The reminder was simple: they might try again, but I will not fold. I will not pay for peace with my dignity ever again. Months passed and nothing dramatic happened, and that was the point. My life became steady in a way I once thought was impossible. I worked my shifts, I paid my bills, and I came home to a quiet house. I fixed what needed fixing, and I rested without waiting for a crisis. Dorothy Cole visited when she could, and we shared tea at the kitchen table. She did not lecture me about forgiveness. She asked if I was sleeping well, and if I was eating enough. That felt like real care, simple and consistent. Victoria Hayes checked in only when needed, because stability does not require constant legal noise. Cedar Grove Community Church stopped being the center of my world, because I stopped letting it define my worth. People can gossip, people can judge, but they cannot live my life for me. Brian Cole and Diane Cole stayed away, because boundaries were documented and consequences were clear. Sometimes I still felt a sharp memory of my birthday, the glass tap, the eyes, the sentence that had cut deep. But I learned to hold that memory like evidence, not like a wound that controls me. It reminded me why I left and why I acted quickly. It reminded me that humiliation was a tool, and the demand for $52,000 was the real goal. It also reminded me that my no was the beginning of my freedom. Kayla Cole kept her distance too, and when she sent an occasional message, it stayed respectful. I did not rebuild closeness, because closeness requires trust, and trust requires time. I wished her growth. But I did not reopen the door. One evening, I stood in my living room, looked around at the calm, and felt something settle in my chest. I realized the house was not the victory, and the eviction was not the victory. The victory was waking up each day and choosing myself without apology. I stopped paying for love with money, and I stopped paying for peace with my dignity. If anyone listening to my story needs one lesson, take this. You are allowed to protect your life, even when family calls it selfish. You are allowed to leave, even when they demand you stay. You are allowed to build a home that feels safe, and you do not have to earn that safety by suffering. The last thing I did, before I truly let the story rest, was walk through the house one more time, slowly, with the lights on and my shoulders relaxed. I checked the doors, the cameras, and the file drawer where I kept everything Victoria Hayes prepared. The deed copies, the notices, the signed agreement, and the receipt summary, all of it sat quietly in order. That order mattered, because my childhood was built on chaos and moving goalposts. Dorothy Cole called that evening, and her voice sounded warm and tired. She told me she was proud, not because I won a fight, but because I stopped letting cruelty shape my choices. I thanked her, and I told her the house finally felt like a home. She said that was what she wanted. Safety that does not ask you to shrink. A week later, I saw a small cake display at the grocery store, and I smiled without bitterness. I bought one, brought it home, and placed it on the table with fresh flowers. I did not invite 43 people, and I did not need witnesses. I lit one candle, and I sat in the quiet. I thought about Brian Cole and Diane Cole, and the way they demanded my savings like it was their right. I thought about Kayla Cole, and how she learned to confuse love with taking. Then I let the thoughts pass, because they were not the center anymore. The center was my breath, my safety, and the calm I built with clear boundaries. The next morning, I went to work, helped my patients, and came home to a place that did not punish me for existing. That is the ending people rarely expect. It is not loud revenge, and it is not a perfect apology. It is a steady life, protected by facts, guided by self-respect, and supported by the few people who choose truth over comfort. If you ever face a family that tries to buy obedience with shame, remember this. You do not need permission to protect your name, your money, and your peace. Sometimes the bravest gift you can give yourself is a quiet birthday where nobody can hurt you again.